In the first half of the 19th century, the United States appeared to be a young nation filled with extraordinary promise. Its population was growing rapidly. New territories stretched westward. Industries expanded, and immigrants arrived from across Europe hoping to build better lives. To many observers, America represented opportunity, freedom, and democracy. Yet beneath that image lay a deep and growing conflict. The nation was divided by profound differences over economics, politics, culture, and above all, slavery. These disagreements gradually widened until compromise became increasingly difficult. By 1861, the United States would descend into the bloodiest conflict in its history, a war that would redefine the nation forever. To understand why the Civil War happened, it is necessary to look decades before the first shots were fired. After gaining independence from Britain in 1783, the United States expanded rapidly. New states entered the Union, and millions of people moved westward in search of farmland and opportunity. However, the North and the South developed along very different paths. In the northern states, industrialization transformed society. Factories appeared in growing cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and later Chicago. Railroads connected communities, canals improved transportation, and manufacturing became a major source of employment. Immigration fueled this economic growth. Millions of newcomers from Ireland, Germany, and other European countries settled in northern cities, providing labor for factories and construction projects. Although agriculture remained important, the northern economy became increasingly diverse. The southern states followed a different course. Warm climates and fertile soil made the region ideal for large-scale agriculture. Plantations produced cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. Among these crops, cotton became the most valuable. After the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793, cotton production increased dramatically. British and northern textile mills demanded enormous quantities of raw cotton. By the mid-19th century, cotton had become America's leading export. This prosperity depended heavily on enslaved labor. Millions of African Americans lived in slavery across the southern states. Enslaved men, women, and children worked long hours under brutal conditions. Families were often separated through sale. Individuals had virtually no legal rights. Many faced violence, punishment, and exploitation throughout their lives. Despite these hardships, enslaved people preserved families, traditions, religious beliefs, music, and hope for future freedom. Some resisted through escape, acts of defiance, slowing work, or assisting others seeking liberty. The existence of slavery created a moral and political question that divided the nation. Many Northerners considered slavery fundamentally wrong, although opinions differed regarding how and when it should end. Others opposed its expansion into new territories, while accepting its continued existence where it already existed. In contrast, many Southern political leaders argued that slavery formed the foundation of their economy and social system. They believed ending it would destroy plantation agriculture and threaten their way of life. These opposing views became increasingly difficult to reconcile. The United States Constitution had postponed fully resolving the issue of slavery. Instead, political compromises attempted to maintain balance between free states and slave states. One important agreement was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri entered the Union as a slave state. Maine entered as a free state. Congress also established a geographic line limiting where slavery could expand in much of the Louisiana Purchase. For a time, the compromise reduced political tensions. It did not eliminate them. As the United States acquired more Western territory following the Mexican-American War in 1848, a new question emerged. Would slavery expand into these new lands? Each new territory threatened to upset the balance of power in Congress. Northern and Southern politicians increasingly viewed every admission of a new state as a struggle over the nation's future. Another attempt to preserve peace came through the Compromise of 1850. California entered as a free state. Other territorial questions remained unsettled. At the same time, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring authorities in free states to assist in returning escaped enslaved people to their owners. The law proved deeply controversial. Many Northerners who had previously remained neutral now opposed being forced to participate in enforcing slavery. Some communities openly resisted. Others organized networks helping freedom seekers escape farther north into Canada. These routes later became known collectively as the Underground Railroad. Despite its name, it was not an actual railroad. It consisted of secret routes, safe houses, and courageous individuals, both black and white, who risked punishment to help enslaved people seek freedom. Among its most famous conductors was Harriet Tubman, who escaped slavery herself before returning repeatedly to guide many others to freedom. Her bravery became legendary. The debate over slavery also intensified through literature. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. The novel portrayed the human suffering caused by slavery and became one of the century's most influential books. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies and shaped public opinion in both America and Europe. Many Southerners criticized the book as inaccurate and unfair. Many Northerners viewed it as a powerful moral argument against slavery. Violence soon followed political disagreement. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether slavery would be permitted. Supporters and opponents rushed into Kansas, hoping to influence the outcome. The result became known as Bleeding Kansas. Armed groups attacked settlements, homes were burned, people were killed. The territory became a symbol of the nation's growing inability to resolve political disputes peacefully. During this period, a new political party emerged. The Republican Party opposed the expansion of slavery into Western territories. Although many early Republicans did not initially advocate abolishing slavery everywhere, they argued that its spread should stop. One of the party's rising leaders was a lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln possessed little formal education, but developed a reputation as an intelligent speaker, skilled lawyer, and thoughtful politician. He believed slavery was morally wrong, while emphasizing preservation of the Union. His debates with Senator Stephen A. Douglas during the Illinois Senate campaign attracted national attention. Although Lincoln lost the election, his speeches established him as an important national figure. Another event further inflamed tensions. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court issued its decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, argued that living in free territories had made him legally free. The court ruled against him. It declared that African Americans could not be citizens under the Constitution, and that Congress lacked authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. The decision outraged many Northerners. Southern leaders generally welcomed it. Political divisions deepened further. Then came one of the most dramatic events before the war. In October 1859, abolitionist John Brown led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown hoped enslaved people would join a widespread uprising against slavery. The plan failed. United States Marines, commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, captured Brown. He was tried, convicted of treason, and executed. To many Northerners, Brown became a martyr, willing to sacrifice his life opposing slavery. To many Southerners, the raid confirmed fears that abolitionists intended violent attacks against their communities. Trust between North and South continued collapsing. The presidential election of 1860 became the defining political moment. The Democratic Party split between Northern and Southern factions. This division weakened its electoral strength. The Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln promised to prevent the expansion of slavery into Western territories while preserving the Union. Although he received almost no electoral support in much of the Deep South, he won enough Northern states to secure the presidency. His victory shocked many Southern leaders. Before Lincoln even took office, several Southern states announced they would leave the Union. Beginning with South Carolina in December 1860, states argued they possessed the constitutional right to secede. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed. Together, they established the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis became its president. The Confederacy declared itself an independent nation. Meanwhile, the federal government maintained that secession was unconstitutional. President-elect Lincoln insisted the Union was permanent. The nation now faced its greatest constitutional crisis. Families found themselves divided. Neighbors argued. Newspapers published increasingly hostile editorials. State governments organized militias. Arsenals accumulated weapons. Railroads transported supplies. Both sides hoped conflict might still be avoided. Yet compromise had become extraordinarily difficult. Decades of disagreement over slavery, states' rights, economic interests, and political power had reached a breaking point. Across the country, Americans waited anxiously. Many believed any fighting would end quickly. Few imagined the terrible reality that lay ahead. Within months, a Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor would ignite a conflict that lasted 4 years, claimed more than 600,000 lives according to traditional estimates, with some modern research suggesting even higher numbers, and forever changed the history of the United States. The American Civil War was about to begin. When Abraham Lincoln took office as the 16th President of the United States on March 4, 1861, the nation was already on the brink of collapse. 7 southern states had declared that they were leaving the Union and had formed the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis had been elected as their president. A new constitution had been written, and Confederate forces had begun taking control of federal forts, arsenals, and government property throughout the South. Despite the crisis, Lincoln's inaugural address struck a careful tone. He insisted that he had no intention of abolishing slavery where it already existed, as the Constitution did not grant him that authority. His primary objective, he declared, was to preserve the Union. At the same time, he firmly rejected the legality of secession, arguing that no state could simply leave the United States whenever it wished. "We are not enemies, but friends," Lincoln appealed. Yet many believed peaceful reconciliation was no longer possible. One federal installation remained under Union control inside Confederate territory: Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The fort was commanded by Major Robert Anderson, whose small garrison faced an increasingly desperate situation. Supplies of food and ammunition were running low, and Confederate authorities demanded that the fort surrender. Lincoln faced a difficult decision. If he abandoned the fort, it might appear that the federal government accepted secession. If he attempted to reinforce it, war could begin. After careful consideration, Lincoln announced that he would send ships carrying food and basic supplies, while informing Confederate leaders that the mission was not intended as a military attack. The Confederacy interpreted the decision differently. President Jefferson Davis concluded that allowing the fort to be reinforced would weaken Confederate authority. He ordered Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard to demand the fort surrender once more. Major Anderson refused. Before dawn on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire. Shells exploded over Charleston Harbor as Fort Sumter answered with his own cannons. The bombardment lasted approximately 34 hours. Smoke filled the sky as explosions echoed across the harbor. Although no soldiers were killed during the actual exchange of fire, the attack marked the official beginning of the American Civil War. Major Anderson eventually surrendered the fort, and Confederate forces took control. News of the attack spread rapidly across the country. In the North, many people who had hoped compromise was still possible now viewed the Confederacy as having initiated armed rebellion. Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 volunteers to defend the Union. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of men rushed to recruitment centers. Many believed the conflict would last only a few months. They expected one decisive battle followed by a quick victory. The South reacted just as passionately. Lincoln's call for troops convinced additional states that remaining in the Union was no longer possible. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy. The Confederate capital was moved from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia, placing it much closer to Washington, D.C. The map of America had changed dramatically. The Union now consisted of 23 states, while 11 states formed the Confederacy. 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union. These border states became strategically important because their location, population, and resources could influence the outcome of the war. Lincoln worked carefully to keep them loyal. Losing states such as Maryland could have isolated the national capital. Although both sides shared a common language, history, and many cultural traditions, they differed significantly in resources. The Union possessed major advantages. It had a population of approximately 22 million people, compared to about 9 million in the Confederacy, including nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans who were denied freedom and citizenship. Most American factories, railroads, banks, and industrial production were located in the North. The Union also maintained a much larger navy and greater manufacturing capacity for weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and supplies. The Confederacy, however, possessed its own strengths. Many Southern military officers had graduated from the prestigious United States Military Academy at West Point. Several experienced commanders resigned from the U.S. Army to serve their home states. Among them was Robert E. Lee. Lee had served with distinction during the Mexican-American War and was widely respected throughout the United States. President Lincoln reportedly considered offering him command of Union forces. Lee opposed secession personally, but after Virginia left the Union, he believed his loyalty belonged to his state. He resigned his U.S. Army commission and accepted command within the Confederate military. His decision became one of the most significant of the entire war. The Union selected General Winfield Scott, an elderly veteran of earlier conflicts, as its senior commander. Scott proposed a long-term strategy, later nicknamed the Anaconda Plan. Rather than relying on one massive battle, he recommended surrounding the Confederacy. The Union Navy would blockade southern ports, preventing exports of cotton and imports of weapons. Federal forces would also gain control of the Mississippi River, effectively dividing the Confederacy in two. Many politicians dismissed the plan as too slow. Public enthusiasm favored a quick offensive. People on both sides believed a single major battle might decide everything. That opportunity arrived in July 1861. Union forces marched south toward Manassas Junction, Virginia. Confederate troops moved to intercept them near a small stream called Bull Run. Spectators from nearby Washington traveled with picnic baskets to watch what they expected would be a brief and exciting military spectacle. Instead, they witnessed chaos. The First Battle of Bull Run, also called the First Battle of Manassas, became the first major battle of the Civil War. Initially, Union troops gained ground. However, Confederate reinforcements arrived by railroad, one of the first significant military uses of rail transport in modern warfare. Among the Confederate commanders was Thomas Jonathan Jackson. During the fighting, one Southern officer reportedly encouraged his men by declaring that Jackson stood like a stone wall. The nickname remained with him forever. Stonewall Jackson soon became one of the Confederacy's most celebrated generals. As Confederate counterattacks intensified, Union formations broke apart. Many inexperienced soldiers panicked. The retreat toward Washington became disorganized. Military wagons, horses, artillery, and civilians crowded the roads. The Confederate victory demonstrated an important truth: the war would not end quickly. Both governments now realized they faced a prolonged struggle requiring enormous resources and national commitment. Recruitment accelerated. Factories expanded production. Railroads became essential military lifelines. Governments introduced new taxes and financial measures to support the war effort. Both armies also faced enormous challenges. Most volunteers possessed little military experience. Campgrounds sprang up across the country. Men learned marching, drilling, weapon handling, camp discipline, and battlefield tactics. Disease quickly became a greater threat than combat. Unsanitary camps, contaminated water, poor medical knowledge, and overcrowded conditions led to outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid fever, pneumonia, and measles. Throughout the Civil War, disease would claim more lives than bullets. Medical care remained limited by modern standards. Doctors possessed no antibiotics. The germ theory of disease was not yet widely accepted. Field hospitals often operated under extremely difficult conditions. Nevertheless, nurses, surgeons, and volunteers worked tirelessly to care for the wounded. Among the most influential humanitarian organizations was the United States Sanitary Commission, which improved medical supplies, hygiene, and nursing support for Union soldiers. Women also assumed increasingly important roles during the conflict. Thousands served as nurses, managed farms and businesses while men fought, organized charitable aid, and supported hospitals. Figures such as Clara Barton, who later founded the American Red Cross, earned lasting respect for their service caring for wounded soldiers on the battlefield. Meanwhile, enslaved African Americans closely followed developments. Although the Union initially fought primarily to preserve the nation rather than abolish slavery, many enslaved people recognized that the conflict might eventually lead to freedom. As Union armies advanced into Confederate territory, increasing numbers escaped plantations and sought protection behind Union lines. Military commanders faced difficult legal and political questions about how to treat these individuals. The answers would gradually transform the purpose of the war itself. By the end of 1861, both the Union and the Confederacy understood that victory would require far more than courage. It would demand industry, leadership, economic endurance, political determination, and the ability to sustain massive armies over several years. Neither side was prepared to surrender. Instead, the conflict was about to enter a far more destructive phase. Across battlefields stretching from Virginia to the Mississippi River, generals would command armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Historic battles such as Antietam, Shiloh, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg would decide the future of the United States. The struggle that many had expected to last only weeks was becoming one of the deadliest and most transformative wars in modern history. By the beginning of 1863, the American Civil War had entered its third year. What many had expected to be a short conflict had become a devastating national tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had already been killed or wounded. Entire towns had been transformed into military camps, farms had become battlefields, and families on both sides lived with constant uncertainty. The war itself was also changing. At first, the Union had fought primarily to preserve the United States as one nation. Now, another goal stood beside it. On January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation declared that enslaved people in areas still under Confederate control were to be considered free. Although it did not immediately free every enslaved person in the United States, it fundamentally changed the character of the war. The conflict had become not only a struggle to preserve the Union, but also a fight against slavery. The proclamation also allowed African American men to serve in the Union Army and Navy. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black soldiers and thousands of black sailors had served in the Union military, making a significant contribution to the Union victory. Meanwhile, military operations intensified across the country. One of the bloodiest days in American history occurred at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Although fought before the Emancipation Proclamation officially took effect, the battle became strategically important because it halted General Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North. The Union claimed a strategic victory, giving Lincoln the confidence to announce the Emancipation Proclamation shortly afterward. Another major turning point came during the summer of 1863. General Lee launched a second invasion of the North, hoping a decisive victory on Union soil might weaken Northern public support for the war and encourage foreign recognition of the Confederacy. Instead, his army encountered Union forces near the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, became the largest battle ever fought in North America. More than 160,000 soldiers participated. After 3 days of fierce fighting, Lee ordered one final assault, known as Pickett's Charge. Thousands of Confederate soldiers advanced across open fields toward heavily defended Union positions. The attack failed. Confederate casualties were enormous. Lee's army retreated back to Virginia. Gettysburg marked a decisive turning point. The Confederacy would never again launch a major invasion of the North. At nearly the same time, another Union victory occurred far to the west. General Ulysses S. Grant captured the strategic city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, after a long siege. With Vicksburg under Union control, the entire Mississippi River came under Federal control, effectively dividing the Confederacy into two parts. This fulfilled one of the major goals of General Winfield Scott's original Anaconda Plan. As Union victories increased, Lincoln appointed Grant as commander of all Union armies in 1864. Grant believed the Union's greater population and industrial strength could eventually overwhelm Confederate forces through continuous pressure. Rather than retreating after major battles, Grant kept advancing. His campaigns resulted in extremely heavy casualties for both sides, but steadily weakened Lee's army. At the same time, General William Tecumseh Sherman launched one of the war's most famous campaigns. After capturing Atlanta, Georgia, Sherman began his march to the sea. His army moved across Georgia towards Savannah, destroying railroads, bridges, factories, warehouses, and military supplies that supported the Confederate war effort. Sherman's strategy aimed to weaken not only Confederate armies, but also their ability to continue fighting. The campaign remains one of the most debated military operations in American history. Supporters argue it shortened the war. Critics point to the widespread destruction experienced by civilians. By early 1865, the Confederacy faced overwhelming challenges. Its economy had largely collapsed. Food shortages became severe. Railroads were heavily damaged. Many Confederate soldiers lacked adequate clothing, ammunition, and supplies. Desertions increased as families struggled to survive at home. Meanwhile, Union armies continued advancing from multiple directions. On April 2, 1865, Confederate forces evacuated Richmond, the Confederate capital. The following day, Union troops entered the city. Only a week later, on April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee met General Ulysses S. Grant at the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. There, Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home after promising not to take up arms again. Many were permitted to keep their horses for spring planting. The respectful meeting between the two generals helped begin the long process of national reconciliation. Although some Confederate forces surrendered later, Appomattox effectively marked the end of the Civil War. Celebrations erupted across much of the North. After 4 years of conflict, peace had finally arrived. The joy was short-lived. On the evening of April 14, 1865, only 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln. The president died the following morning. The nation mourned. Millions viewed Lincoln's funeral procession as it traveled across several states before his burial in Springfield, Illinois. His assassination shocked the country and profoundly influenced the difficult years that followed. The period after the war became known as Reconstruction. The United States faced enormous challenges. Southern cities and infrastructure required rebuilding. Former Confederate states needed to be reintegrated into the Union. Most importantly, approximately 4 million formerly enslaved African Americans began life as free people. Freedom, however, did not immediately bring equality. Formerly enslaved families searched for relatives from whom they had been separated. Communities established schools, churches, and businesses. At the same time, many Southern states introduced laws restricting the rights of African Americans, creating new struggles that would continue for generations. The Civil War also transformed the United States Constitution. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery throughout the nation. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to those born or naturalized in the United States. The 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, although many barriers remained in practice for decades afterward. The cost of the war was staggering. Modern historians estimate that approximately 750,000 Americans may have died from combat, disease, and related causes, making it the deadliest conflict in United States history. Countless more were wounded. Entire communities experienced lasting grief. The American Civil War preserved the Union and ended legal slavery in the United States, but it also left deep political, social, and economic divisions that continue to shape the nation long after the fighting ended. Today, historians remember the Civil War as one of the defining events in American history. It demonstrated both the strength and fragility of democracy. It showed how political disagreements, when left unresolved, can escalate into devastating conflict. It ended one of the nation's greatest injustices, legal slavery, while beginning a long and continuing struggle for civil rights and equality. The battlefields of Gettysburg, Antietam, Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Appomattox are now preserved as places of remembrance. They stand not only as memorials to those who fought and died, but also as reminders of the immense human cost of division and war. More than 160 years later, the legacy of the American Civil War continues to influence discussions about freedom, equality, citizenship, and national identity. It remains a story of courage and sacrifice, tragedy and transformation, and of a nation forever changed by the greatest conflict in its history.